Last week, we went through, not in like fine detail, but we went through the whole chapter of Matthew 23, and we really just saw this whole time where, Jesus was done talking to the scribes and the Pharisees. He was done, going back and forth with them, and he kind of just laid into them last week and, shared a little piece of his mind with them. But Jesus was just calling these guys out. He was challenging them. He had shut down their questions. He had a lot of things to say to them, but we looked at last week and kind of our focus was really Jesus challenging them, and well, not even really challenging them because he was talking to the crowds around them. But Jesus was telling the crowds around them to watch out for these guys because one, they lack authenticity. Like they say one thing and they do another. Jesus is like, you can listen to some of their words might be fine, but don't you live like them, because they don't live right. And so Jesus was pointing out their lack of authenticity, but he's also pointing out in several occasions really how they abused the power of their role. Like they had this position, they had titles, and even through that they were kind of abusing people. Like it says they were taking advantage of widows. They were leading people to the wrong places to be worse than they were. They were doing things that they shouldn't be doing, but they looked like they should be the right guys. They were religious leaders. They had titles. People looked up to them. It's like, it looks like they should have been the ones that you would be following. But Jesus said, watch out. Because like we talked about last week, and we saw Jesus say it a number of times, is that not everybody who has a title, not everybody who claims this or that is what they say they are. And Jesus has warned us numerous times about wolves in sheep's clothing. And so Jesus was having that conversation with the crowds last week. He was saying all these things. He was laying into the scribes and the Pharisees and the leaders. And then he's he's leaving the temple at the end of 23. And we're going to pick up this morning in Matthew chapter 24. Now there's a big turn of what Jesus is talking about. There's going to be a lot going on here. And we'll try to break it down somewhat and see what Jesus is saying. So we're going to read the first 28 verses of Matthew 24. It says, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. He's just leaving after that last conversation. And his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, earthquakes in various places. All of these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all of the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. And if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Now, a lot going on here. This is a dramatic change of direction in Jesus' conversation with his disciples. As I said, the first verse there puts this right in the wake of what Jesus was saying last week. He had just told these guys in the temple. They had just left the temple. It says Jesus went out and departed from there. And it's kind of interesting because, you know, the doubling up of the statement there in verse 1, when it says he went out and departed, in the original language there, it's like there's like a greater emphasis on it when it's doubled down like that. Because it's really, I mean, the belief is the way that it's written like that is because there's an understanding that Jesus is never coming back to that temple. He had been there many times. He had frequented it. All these last couple chapters of Matthew, he had been back in the temple every day dealing with things. But at this point, it says he went out and departed. We know what's coming next. Like, we know what's coming next in Matthew, like the sequence of events that's leading to his crucifixion. Verse 1, there's an emphasis here because though Jesus frequented here many times, he is not coming back to this temple because there's a lot that lies in front of him right now. But as they were walking away, him and his disciples, he went out, he departed from the temple for the last time. As they were walking away, his disciples, they turned to him and they're basically like, Jesus, look at this place. It says there, it says his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. Like he had never seen it before. He'd been there many times. But the reality is that the temple must have been stunning to look at. Like if you hear the accounts of what it looked like and even the different versions of it and such, because this is actually the second temple, the one that Jesus is standing in front of right now. The second temple had been built about 500 years before this moment. It's about 500 years. The interesting thing is, and sometimes we don't realize some of these practical things, I don't know, it's kind of interesting to me. The temple is actually under renovation right now. Like at the moment when Jesus is standing there in front of the temple, it's actually being renovated. It's going through a process of renovations by King Herod. They're making it even grander and more amazing. Like to think of the scale of work that was going on this thing, the non-biblical history. There's a lot of historians that were still writing stuff at the same time. And some of the historians say that like during this period, there's 10,000 people at a time working on the temple. Like there's 10,000 workers working on renovating the temple right now. I mean, this is an incredible place. It was like absolutely stunning to look at. If you look at some of the history of some of the accounts of how it looked at that time, they said it was basically built of blocks of pure white marble. Like they looked for the purity of the marble, built it out of pure white marble. Almost the entire exterior of the temple was covered in gold plates. I mean, it was pure white and gold. There's the historical accounts of even other people writing about like coming over the hills and seeing the temple. They said, I mean, it shone like the sun, but it looked like there was snow on it because the purity of the whiteness of the marble and the reflection of the gold as the sun hit it, they said, is just absolutely incredible to see. But the disciples directed Jesus to look back at it, and then you see Jesus' response. Jesus says, do you not see all these things? He's looking at the temple. He says, assuredly I say to you that not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Like they're like, look how amazing this is. Like it's literally being renovated at this point. It's been standing for 500 years. I mean, it's an incredible place. The disciples are like, check this out, Jesus. And Jesus is like, this temple is going to be destroyed. It's going to be destroyed to the point that not one stone shall be left stacked on another one. Like that's pretty thorough destruction. I mean, there's, you can find, even you think World War II and where cities were just leveled, you still found bricks stacked on top of bricks. I mean, there was incredible destruction, but you still found parts of buildings standing. Jesus says that when this temple is destroyed, that there won't be a single stone left standing on top of another one. That had to have caught them off guard a little bit. I mean, they're like, this place is amazing. This is God's temple. Jesus is like, it's going to be destroyed. Like, I don't think that that's what they were expecting. But Jesus says this. He tells them about the destruction of the temple. And then they walk a short distance and they end up on the Mount of Olives there in verse 3. It says, now he sat on the Mount of Olives. Now, I think when we hear like, oh, now they're on this mountain of olives, it sounds like they traveled some great distance and they climbed some mountain and they were, like, it was actually very, very close to where they were at. Like the Mountain of Olives, the peak of the mountain, actually I have a picture right there. This picture is taken from the top of the Mount of Olives. And where that, well, the Dome of the Rock is, from this to there is where they believe the temple stood. So this is approximately where Jesus was sitting and talking to his disciples. Like where this is viewed from is approximately where they were sitting at this moment, just overlooking where the temple sat. So it likely sat within those retaining walls. So it wasn't a long distance. Like they weren't, going some long travel. Like it's less than like a third of a mile, something like that. Probably walk there in a couple minutes. So pretty close. But up there, there's still, Jesus just told them the temple's going to be destroyed. That had they caught them off guard a little bit. They're still kind of looking down at where it is. And then his disciples begin to ask him some questions. So disciples, as they're sitting here and they're looking down there, they say, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? They begin to ask these questions in light of Jesus just telling them that the temple is going to be destroyed. But it's very likely that when the disciples were asking this question, it was kind of like a rambling on of a single question. They're like all of these things are going through their head. I think they see all of these different things as one singular event. Like if the temple is going to be destroyed, then obviously that means you must be coming back and that must be the end of the age. Like surely that all of these things are going to coincide at the same time. It's likely that that's like probably the way that they were thinking at this point. So they probably they thought they were asking one question, but there's really a couple of questions included inside of there. But from where we're sitting now, and again, there's going to be a little more, history in this morning probably, but from where we're sitting now, we have a little bit bigger scope of history. Like we get to see a little bit more of how things went down. From where we're sitting and what we know now historically, that about 37 years after this conversation takes place, about 37 years after this, the temple will be destroyed. They're sitting on this mountain right now, looking down at that area. About 37 years after this, the temple will be destroyed. And it's destroyed exactly how Jesus describes it will be. And he says it will be left not one stone upon another. And there's actually good explanation to why that happens. Because, you have all of that gold on the outside of the temple. And historically, the account says that somewhere in the process, one of the Roman soldiers, because it's in 70 AD, which is, again, like 37 years after this, Rome sieges Jerusalem. They come in to destroy the city. And one of the soldiers lights a fire. Fire begins to consume the temple. And when that's happening, all of the gold that is on the outside of the temple begins to melt into and in between the marble blocks and in between all of the cracks and crevices of the temple. So in an effort by the Romans to retrieve all that gold, they disassembled the temple, every single block of it, to get to all of the gold that melted down into the cracks of it. So there's a good reason why it happened exactly the way Jesus said it was going to happen. It was left so thoroughly dismantled that they haven't really been able to determine the exact positioning of the temple because there's literally nothing left even down to the foundations of it. Like they know one of the Wailing Wall where the modern day Jews still go to in Jerusalem. The Wailing Wall is part of the original exterior the retaining wall. It wasn't one of the walls of the temple, but it was one of the walls of the area around the temple. So they know that it was in that area, but they can't tell exactly where it was at because it was so thoroughly destroyed. And then it happened. Like I said, Jesus said this. I mean, you see some of these prophecies like, oh, these are hundreds of years out. I mean, this one was only 37 years out, but it was still so ridiculously spot on. It's like, I mean, you would expect that it's, still be pieces of it, but it was destroyed exactly the way Jesus said. But the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And obviously, the disciples were asking, well, when's the temple going to be destroyed? When are you going to come back? When's the age going to end? Like I said, I think they were probably thinking this is all the same thing. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and obviously Jesus didn't come back at that moment. The age didn't end. And now we have to look at Jesus' response here because we're still waiting for the fulfillment of these things. We're still waiting for all of this to happen. And so Jesus, as he begins to engage with their questions, I'm just going to, title this area, he begins to give the signs of the end times. He begins to list signs to look for. You see some of these in verses, let's just say 4 through 8. It says, and Jesus said to them, starting at verse 4, he says, take heed that no one deceives you. This is a direct response to the question. He says, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, earthquakes in various places. All of these are the beginning of the sorrows. So Jesus, in verses 4 and 5, he warns of deceivers. I mean, we were kind of looking at that last week. There were already deceivers in play. Jesus is warning that more deceivers will come. He's saying that people will literally come saying that they are him, claiming to be in his name, that deceivers will come. He says that there will be wars and rumors of war, that there will be famines, diseases, earthquakes. And then Jesus says, all of these are the beginning of the sorrows. Now we look at these things. All of these things, every single one of them, have already happened in this world. Like, they happen. But what we're looking at here is a time where they'll be coming in greater effect. They'll be coming more and more. It will be more constant. When I look at the beginning of sorrows, I'm like, I know this is a bad time coming, that the Bible's talking about. It sounds kind of cool though. It sounds kind of ominous. I think of like a dystopian movie, like Beginning of Sorrows. That's what it kind of sounds like to me. But there's actually a better translation of this. The better translation of this, really, when you talk about the sorrows, a better translation of the word sorrows from the original language would be like birth pains. It's talking about like I have not given birth. I was there with my wife when she did, but some in this room obviously have. But it's the contractions that start feeling, like the pains prior to birth. Like that the child is coming when certain things start happening, and that starts coming in greater and greater frequency and greater intensity. And so when we look, these are the beginnings of the sorrows. It's the beginnings of the birth pains. It's like the contractions are just starting. And they will come in greater frequency, greater intensity. And so, like, we have seen some of these things. And usually whenever there's a large event in the world, like, obviously some people are like, is this the end? I know, like, I think the day that, the shutdowns happened, the lockdowns happened with COVID, the very first question I fielded the day that the lockdown happened from somebody was, is this the end? Like, is this the last moments? Is this is the disease? Is this the pestilence? Is this the last moment? But my response to that person, and where we're going to be kind of ending up today, is that all of these things have happened throughout time, and they will keep happening, but they will happen more and in greater frequency. And when all of these things start coming together with some more things that we're going to look at, well, then there's going to be some indicators that that something more is happening here. But like every little thing that happens, or big thing, like COVID was a huge thing. But it's like our immediate thing is like, this is the end. It's not the end. Like, we don't know. It could be. What we need to talk about today is a state of preparedness. And that's what we're going to kind of get to through all of this, is a state of preparedness. But when Jesus is listing all of these various things that are happening, and things like I said, we've seen all these. We've seen famines. We've seen pestilences or diseases. We see earthquakes all the time in Southern California. We see wars. Like, there's wars happening in this world right now. We see these things. But Jesus looks at this. He lists out all of these things. I want you to notice something specifically, because he just says also that this is the beginning of the sorrows. Even as these things grow in greater intensity, even as more of them come, even as a lot of this comes simultaneously someday, Jesus says this is still yet the beginning of the things that will be happening. Jesus adds more to this list. He says that his followers will be delivered up to tribulation and persecution. He says that some will be killed. He says all will be hated by all nations for his name's sake. Many will be offended, betrayed, hated. It says false prophets will rise up and deceive many. It says lawlessness and lawbreaking will abound. And it says, and love will grow cold. Like, you see all of these things, and there's very specific statements made for God's people. And this is one of those things where it's like, are you on the boat? So, because, there's sometimes a picture painted of Christianity that, with Jesus, everything's just going to be wonderful. It is, but how we define that wonderful is important. Because wonderful with Jesus should be, I have Jesus no matter what goes on otherwise. The wonderful part of Jesus is, I am his. I have relationship with him. I will be with him forever. Now, a whole lot might go on alongside of that, but that doesn't take away the wonderful with Jesus. That some will say that he will make everything easy. He will take away every problem. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say that at all. Does he bless us? Is he there for us? Does he care for us? Absolutely. But this is one of those things where, you're going to get on the boat or not. Because know that to walk with Jesus does not mean easy life. Know that to walk with Jesus, his scripture says very clearly that it will likely be harder than not walking with Jesus. But I will tell you that it's good. I'll tell you that it's worth it. I will tell you that what you look forward to in being with him is so much greater than anything you can possibly imagine here. But will it be an easy road to get there? Probably not if you truly follow him. Probably not if we end up living through any of this. We'd see this in little small glimpses here and there, but it's going to get worse. It's going to get bad. I don't know if that's going to happen in our lifetime. We'll see. But are we with him or are we not? Jesus says, many call me Lord, Lord, but I'm going to come to the day where I'm going to say, I don't know you. Do we really know him? Are we really with him? Will we walk through all of this and stay faithful to him because we are so committed to? Are we prepared to do that? Like I said, these are still the beginnings and working through some of the sorrows. But I do want us to see that even when this time comes, that there will still be a light shining through the darkness of all of this. You see in verses 13 and 14 here, it says all of these things are happening, all this list that we just read, but it says, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all of the world as a witness to all of the nations, and then the end will come. There's still light shining through, because even when, we're not in a world that's this crazy yet. I think sometimes people act like we are, but we're not. The world's crazy, but it's not as bad as it's going to get. There is some hostility towards Christians. I would say more so in a lot of other nations. I think sometimes the things that people claim as hostility towards Christians in America is just, sometimes it's your own problems. Sometimes it's, Christians acting foolishly and people calling them out or treating them poorly as a result of that. Unfortunately, that's the case. Sometimes, obviously, there is hostility towards Christians, but not at the level that, some of our brothers and sisters are facing in other countries and some of the things that people go through. some of the things that all of Jesus' disciples were going to go through. Every single one of these guys, but one, will die at the hands of other people for the name of Jesus. Every single one. And the one that survived, they tried to kill him several times. I mean, all but one will die at the hands of others. Like, we don't have it that bad. And unfortunately, it's like in our, relative ease compared to some of these other people, that means we should push forward all the more. Like, we should be doing more. We should be more in the spreading and broadcasting of his name. It should be, because it is easier for us. It's going to come a day where it's going to be harder and it's going to have more immediate consequences. It talks about, Jesus says, my people will be killed for my name's sake in these times. But then Jesus says, and the end will come. Everything leading up to this point in chapter 24 says we're the birth pains, we're the contractions, were the pains of birth, the frequency, the intensity building, more and more of these things happening, more and more of them happening at once, them getting worse, the events getting worse. But then the end will come. In verse 15, a very specific sign is given. Jesus says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. And then it says, then run away and don't grab your clothes. Like it says, this is the sign that you're looking for, the abomination of desolation. On the screen, the abomination, desolation. It's a scary sounding thing too. Jesus notes that this specifically was spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Again, Daniel would have written these things some 550 years before this point. Daniel was alive about 550 to 600 years before the moment that Jesus is saying these things. But Jesus references that Daniel talked about this. We're not going to turn there, but I'm going to put a few verses. There's a couple of places in Daniel where he specifically mentions this. I'll read a couple of these. And I'm not going to break it down as we go. We're going to read through these passages, and I'll kind of list out what they say and what they mean. So Daniel 9:27, it says, then he shall confirm a covenant. And this is very likely talking about what we would refer to as the Antichrist eventually. It says, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. It's 9:27. 11:31, it says, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. It's talking about happening in the temple. Daniel 12:11, and from that time, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. It's very specific. Now, what does this all mean? I would take a lot of things, even as we look towards prophecy and such, there's a lot of different ways that people look at these things. And I'm not one to really, fault most of the different ways that people look at these things, because frankly, we don't know until we get there how all of these things are going to look. There's an overriding thing that I want you to see through all of this, that even if we have different viewpoints on how some of these things may work out someday, because matter of fact, you don't know exactly. What we need to see through all of this is still the life for Christ that we have right now and the expectation of him coming, and how we live from this point to that point. And we'll find out about these things along the way if we live through these times. But the general understanding that people come to, that scholars that have researched these things come through, when you break down all these things in Matthew or in Daniel and some of his other writings, in Daniel's writings you find that there will be a future leader, likely a world leader at some point, that he will make a treaty with the people of Israel. So this is something that we might be looking forward to, that there will be a world leader that will likely make a treaty with the people of Israel. That treaty is described by Daniel as being 1 week, but it's generally understood that each day of that week refers to a year. And so it's supposed to be a 7-year treaty with the people of Israel. Halfway through that 7 years, that ruler will gather military forces and he will stop sacrifices and offerings at the temple. Now, obviously, right now, there is not a temple standing. It was taken stone from stone and it has not been rebuilt. There's many that have an expectation that before this happens, that there will be a temple rebuilt in Israel. We don't know definitively, but that's, there's a general understanding that many have that there will be a temple rebuilt in Israel before we see these things happen. So, and then if that happens, then they will restart sacrifices and offerings. But in the middle of this 7 years, that the sacrifices and offerings will be stopped. That world leader who has made the treaty with Israel is expected to put some sort of idol or abominable object into the temple of God. That's the expectation, is the abomination of desolation, that there will be some sort of sacrilegious abomination put into the temple of God. That desecration of the temple will continue until the judgment of God is unleashed upon the Antichrist and all of his followers. And as it says there, the expectation is that the moment that that idol or that abomination is set up, there will be a countdown of 1,290 days until God rains down judgment. It's a lot to take in. This is what Jesus is talking about. This is what he is referencing from the prophet Daniel. Now, but it's interesting though, because again, there's very divided views on this subject. Because even when you talk about the abomination of desolation, there's really 3 different views. One was that it already happened before Jesus was talking at this moment. Some people believe that the abomination of desolation happened in 167 BC. Again, history. There was a leader called Antiochus Epiphanes, and he went into the temple in 167 BC. He actually sacrificed a pig, which would be an unclean animal by God's law. He sacrificed a pig in the temple to Zeus, the Greek god, and set up a statue of Zeus in the temple of God. This happened in 167 BC. Some people look at that moment as the abomination of desolation. Don't know if that really lines up with everything that is said, though, in these passages. There's another time in 70 AD when we talked about when the temple was destroyed. People believe that just the Roman armies going in and their other gods and the stuff that they were carrying with them was the abomination that came into the temple. Some people believe that happened in 70 AD, or the third belief is that it hasn't happened yet, and we are still looking forward to the day when all of these things go down. I personally have always leaned more towards the future view of this, because in some of the interpretations and the literal way you can take some of these things, none of those other dates make sense in terms of the things that were happening up to it and the stuff happening immediately after. Because it talks about when, well, I think it's our next point. I don't want to drag this out too long. But when this event happens, when the abomination of desolation is set up, it is supposed to usher in what we call the Great Tribulation. The Great Tribulation. In this passage we just read, it says that the Great Tribulation will be the worst time in all of world history before that point and after that point. It will be the worst that this world has ever seen. It says when this happens, the abomination that is supposed to usher in the worst time that this world has ever seen. In 163 or 167 BC and 70 AD, there's nothing in that time frame that is the worst that the world has ever seen for a long period of time. Like it didn't happen right. Like that didn't happen. Nothing lines up to make it look like that's the case. Like I said, Jesus is saying that this great tribulation will be the worst time in all of world history. When you think about that, you got to think, that's sobering to hear, because this world's gone through a lot. Like when you think of all of the diseases, famines, depressions, wars, genocide, and so much more, it's crazy to think that there is a time coming that will be significantly worse than all of that. That's really sobering to think about. It's going to be absolutely terrible. And Jesus tells us that even through this time that there will be still people trying to deceive others, to get them to go away from God, to follow false prophets. Jesus says, don't believe any of it. But why? How will God's people know what's real and what's not? How will God's people know when Jesus actually comes back? Jesus says, all these false ones are going to pop up. Don't follow them. Don't pay attention to them. Like, how will we know? How will we know when it's real? God's people will know it's real because when he does actually come, it's going to be extremely obvious. It's going to be completely obvious when Jesus gets back. In verse 27 of this passage, it says, as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will the coming of man be. Like lightning flashing across the sky, so will his coming be. And there's going to be a lot more detail on this one next week that makes it even way more obvious. But what we need to know is, we don't need to wonder, it's like, is this guy, like I watched this video years ago of this guy in Russia that, he dressed himself up to look like, the old painted version of white Jesus with the long hair and, fair skin and stuff. And so he made himself look like that, dressed in the robes. And he had this whole community of people that follow him, and he told them that he's Jesus. That's not him. When he gets here, it will be obvious. It's not going to be like, oh, I found some guy in the hills of Russia that says he's Jesus. No, that's not him. That is no way. Like when Jesus gets here, everybody is going to know he's here. You're not going to be wondering about it. You're going to know. So there's going to be even more next week that makes it even more obvious. But what I want us to consider as we prepare for next week, like I said, there's a lot going on here. There's history, there's future, talk of terrible things. Like we pay attention to these things, we learn these things. There's a lot of, differences on what people believe this is going to look like. There's people believe some of this already happened, some didn't. Like pieces of it happened, none of it's happened. Like, there's people that have beliefs all over this spectrum. Like I believe a lot of this is still future coming, for the most part. It's still on its way. But let's make a statement here that sometimes I think people get so caught up in the signs and prophecies of the future that they miss living for Jesus in the present. That's why this is important. Like we look out for these things. We pay attention to these things. But like I said, sometimes I think people get so caught up with, it's all just news and world events and pay attention to those things. But that's all it is. Like I'm just looking around, I'm seeing, is Jesus come back soon? It's like, Jesus wants you to live for him. He says that you will not know when I'm coming back, but when I get here, you'll know. Next week, we're going to be looking at a passage that's really going to clearly talk about what we do between now and then. But like I said, I think sometimes, I don't know, I think maybe it's like the intellectual knowledge side of it. It's like, oh, we want to know all the fine details. Like a lot of this stuff you can't nail down specifically. And I honestly think, personally, my personal belief is, I believe God intentionally leaves vagueness in these things. Because if God said, my son will be coming back on, November 17, 2057, I was like, well, I got a lot of time to do whatever I want before that point. It's like, I think that there is some intentional vagueness to it to lead every generation of people to still have some urgency for Christ's return, to still live in, looking for the signs that are coming and dealing with the things of the world, but still living purposely for him because it's not exactly clear how these things are going to play. I think the lack of clarity helps us really to have some urgency and still live with expectation because we don't just know the exact date and time that it's going to happen. So I encourage you, know these things. I think they're interesting. I think that they're good to know the signs and to look for some of these things, to pay attention to what is going on in the world. But every time that there's a disease or war or natural disaster, doesn't mean it's the end. I think it should be another I need to be living all the more for Jesus, because it might be the birth pains might be getting getting closer, they might be getting more intense. This might signal that he's on the way. Depending on how we take some of these things, there's a large belief that the temple has to be rebuilt in Jerusalem before some of this happens. I don't know if that's a thing. I would be okay with somebody saying either way on that. But it's if we have the idea of the temple has to be rebuilt and such, then that kind of still puts us in a place of I can do whatever I want until the temple is rebuilt, because nothing's going to happen before that point. I would say still live with urgency. Still live for him. Still live in the present, but pay attention. Live in the present, but pay attention. They said, whether these things begin happening, like I said, some of this has already begun happening, but whether they begin happening tomorrow or next year or 5 years from now, hopefully we are living in such a way that we're just ready regardless. It's not I'm going to clean up my act when a little bit more of these things start happening. No. It's let's just be ready now. And we're going to talk about that a lot more next week. So it's been a lot of information, a lot of things going on. If you have questions to talk about, I don't know, again, there's not a crystal clear answer on all of these things, but if there's things you want to talk about, we can talk about it. We can look into it together. Like I said, more than anything, let's still live with expectation. Let's still live with purpose in the present. So, let's pray.